Good morning, everybody. As always, do you have questions? And did you do some of the homework, and do you want to discuss it with me? So first, questions. We had many slides last week, and so what questions do you have? What is really funny for me, when I started using laptops, it took roughly the same time to start an application as it takes today. At that time, I expected it to become faster, but okay. So it was 39. Okay.
Is the same pair of sender and receiver always use the same sequence of mixes?
Okay. Probably we could even frame your question: do sender and recipient use the same sequence of mixes even more broadly? Are we going to fix the sequence of mixes somehow? Or do we leave it to the decision of each user what to use, how to use it? What arguments do you see?
I think it's not safe to always use the same sequence of mixes.
So you feel using always the same sequence of mixes is a bad idea. What is your argument for this?
Unfortunately, one message is detected and the sender or the receiver is found, then all the following messages can be identified.
I'm not sure whether I understood you for acoustic reasons, but as far as I understood you, I would guess you wanted to say, hey, if this sequence of mixes is badly chosen, maybe all the mixes are working against me, then if I'm always using that sequence of mixes, then this really is a problem. Is this what you wanted to say? No. Okay. I see in your eyes it's no. So please repeat your argument.
I mean, if they always use the same sequence of mixes, then if one of the messages was detected by the detector and he found which one is the sender or which one is the receiver, then all the following messages can be.
Okay. So next, try to repeat your argument. So your argument is, if I statically using always the same, then if someone managed to find out, let's say in one case, what really happened, then because I'm doing it in the same way each time, he effectively finds out for all the use cases what really happened. Is this your argument? Okay, now I see in your eyes it's okay, yes. Okay. What is the implicit assumption in your argument? I think as you see it, as you perceive it, your argument is true, but you have an assumption. And in building a system, I would try to make your assumption invalid. And then we come to a different conclusion. So what is your hidden assumption? And by the way, at the meta level, this is usually the tricky point. If people disagree about something, it's not that one is stupid and the other is clever. Usually both are okay, but they have different implicit assumptions. And if you want to come up to a rational decision, then you have to spell out what are the assumptions, the underlying assumptions. So what is your assumption? Okay, I help you. I think the assumption you have is, if I statically say this is my sequence of mixes, then everybody else does in some sense the same. He has a static sequence of mixes, but he has a different sequence of mixes, right? Because if everybody would have the same sequence of mixes, it wouldn't tell anything that this sequence is used, right? So the hidden assumption is if we are fixing it for each person, it will nevertheless be different for each person. Okay. I already mentioned I will try to make your assumption invalid. So I would argue if we fix it, then it should be the same for everyone. And I will give you a reason that fixing it is a good idea. But then the negation of your assumption has to be valid. That is, we should have the same sequence of mixes for everyone. So why would I argue that fixing it is a good idea? It depends on my perception when a system is broken. You can say a system is broken, an anonymity system is broken, if I'm able as an attacker to monitor all messages the sender is sending, or all messages the recipient is receiving. This surely would mean the system is broken. Many people have this definition in mind but never spell it out. The extremely other definition, the other extreme would be the system is broken if I can trace a single message. It's pretty clear that the assumption it's broken if I can trace everything, this is a quite modest assumption. The demand imposed on the system is not particularly high. My second definition, it's broken if I can trace any message. This is much more demanding, right? So now we are talking about definitions. Which definition is right? Of course, this question is nonsense because there's not a right and a wrong definition. It's, if you're talking about definition more, what is an adequate definition? What are consequences of a definition? But in mathematics, in engineering, you can define everything as you like. It's up to you. The question for definition is it relevant? Does it describe in some truthful way what we want to model or what we want to talk about? Coming back to the definitions. If you have the feeling, my attacker is Google. They want to monitor everything I do. And I'm pretty happy if I can make sure they can't monitor everything I do. Maybe then your definition is a good starting point. Assuming you are just a normal user, you have nothing particularly to hide. So if some of your messages are traced to you, it's okay, as long as it's not too many messages or not too large a fraction of the messages which are traced back to you. Now let's assume we are changing the environment. Let's talk about a country, call it X, where we have a government which is suppressing a freedom within the country. There are many governments X on the world. Often, governments who suppress their people are not very happy if some secrets about the government are communicated to journalists, to the outside world, etc., etc. So in some countries, if you are delivering information to the so-called enemies of the country, which could be other countries and other citizens who are interested in freedom or democracy, then it gets a matter of life and death, whether it's traceable or not. And if you want to use an anonymity system for purposes where it can get a question of life and death, then I would argue my definition, it's broken. If a single message can be traced, is a more adequate definition. Because if one of your messages can be traced, probably thereafter, after a few hours or days, you are dead. Or putting it in another way, if you can't trust that it's really protecting all of your communication, then if you are a clever guy, you won't use it, you won't communicate any critical content using this system. Okay, so we see the degree or the kind of anonymity we expect has many dimensions. I addressed just one dimension, saying how reliable is it that I get anonymity. You would say, hey, some kind of best effort anonymity, it's not broken always, so somehow I get it, or at least sometimes I get it. And I would insist, hey, this is a really hard kind of anonymity I always get. There are, of course, other properties of anonymity. For example, we could discuss in which large crowd, or am I anonymous in a large crowd or in a small crowd? For example, if it's a suppressive government, if they can trace down a message not maybe to you, but they are sure it's you or 4 colleagues, then depending on the government, they will kill all 5 people, because killing people in some governments is really cheap. And standing the problem that some information which gives bad reputation to the country is leaving the country, it's a much larger, or it's much more expensive, as seen from the government, than killing 5 people. Of course, if it's not 5 people who could have sent it, but if it's 1 million people out of a population of, let's say, 10 million people, then I would say, even a really suppressive government probably will not kill 10% of the population, because it means a decrease in power of that country. In history, nevertheless, there have been governments who killed 10% of the population. Nazi Germany, for example, the Third World War, in effect killed that percentage of population in Russia, in Germany, and in other countries. So yes, it happened. But to the best of my knowing, even Nazi Germany didn't start the war with the intention to kill 10% of the German population. They didn't care about the Russian population or Poland or other countries, but they surely didn't start it with the feeling, okay, we're going to kill 10% of our population. Okay. So a second dimension of anonymity surely is how large is the crowd you are anonymous in? And maybe there are other properties. So, coming back to your question, should we fix the route? It's pretty clear, if you fix the route, then you should try to fix it for everyone in the same fashion. If you can't fix it for everyone in the same fashion, then maybe it's a good idea to say, change it frequently. Now let's assume for the moment that a mix either is good or bad. Okay, this is of course an oversimplification. In reality, usually no entity is either only good or only bad. Why? Depends for whom. if a mix is, let's say, supporting the freedom movement, but he's not supporting, let's say, the unions or whatever, so maybe good for someone, bad for someone else. One distinction. Or a mix, mainly it's a computer. Is your computer always secure to the same degree? I would say my computer, no. Why? Sometimes weaknesses of the operating system or some application software which is running on my computer is published. Hopefully, I get a patch, in my case by Apple, before malware exploiting the weakness is on the market. So usually, the security of my computer is changing all the time. If weaknesses are detected, it's decreasing. And if these weaknesses are being patched, and if I really do the patch, what indeed I do, it's one of my highest priority. If I get a new version or safety critical patch, then do it immediately. Then it's increasing. So the assumption that my computer is always trustworthy to the same degree may be ill-found. But now, just for to get at a simple argument, if a mix would just be good and bad, then I would argue the best strategy I could have for choosing a mix sequence is use one mix sequence and stay with the decision. Either I'm lucky and I did choose at least one good mix, or at least one mix which is good to me and my friends. Then I have good luck. If I'm going to change my mix sequence, I'm only taking additional risk, right? If I have bad luck in choosing my first mix sequence, and if it's a matter of life and death, I'm dead. I'm dead. No reason to choose further mixes. So you see, and I think this is the outcome that I wanted to make it. Many people who start into a discussion whether to choose mix sequences statically or dynamically start with the feeling more by dynamics is good because it makes it harder for the attacker to follow the dynamics. This is the intuition behind your argument and probably the common feeling nearly everyone shares. If breaking the system means breaking it always, I buy your argument. If the attacker has to follow all the changes all the time, it may make his work harder. If the system is broken, if the attacker breaks it once, then I would say, no, you shouldn't change. Stay with your original choice. With the sole exception that, of course, if a mix goes out of service, you have somehow to replace it. You can't stop communication for the rest of your life, I assume. Okay. Maybe my answer was more lengthy than you expected it to be, but I hope it was somehow a clear answer in the sense, hey, it's not right and wrong. You have first to think what you expect, and then you can draw some conclusions. Okay? Further questions?
I think there's one problem with coordinating that everyone has the same mix sequence. Because if the amount of users is pretty large, there has to be, well, some kind of central entity who coordinates the sequence. And then you have to trust that entity again. And that might be problematic.
Yes. I would even go further. First, the problem you describe, somehow I could try to solve. For example, there are protocols to toss coins over a network. And to avoid a central entity, I could just execute a protocol of all the users tossing coins, who should be the first mix, who should be the second mix, etc. But if we agree on one global sequence of mixes, what are we creating? A performance bottleneck. Because all the traffic has to go through that particular sequence. How is the expected performance of such a fixed mix sequence? First, it gets faster if traffic increases, if the number of users increases, because batching usually requires you are waiting on enough messages to be there, and only then you proceed. So first, if you are increasing the load on the mixes, it gets faster, which is a nice thing. But of course, in the end, if you increase and increase and increase, you start to overload either mixes or links. And then the performance doesn't increase, and maybe the relative performance compared to the demand decreases. And if this happens, then as an engineer, you will say, hey, we have to do something about it. Probably one sequence of mixes is not enough. So let's have a second one. How do we use it? Probably you won't argue that for even messages, you should use this sequence of mixes. For odd messages, odd numbered messages, you should use that sequence, because now you're combining the insecurity. If one of the sequences is broken, your message or your communication relationship can be traced. So probably your recommendation would be, hey, as long as it increases, if demand increases, it's nice. Stay with the mix sequence you did choose. And at the very moment it starts decreasing, we stop admitting new users to this mix sequence, but we start a new mix sequence. Maybe initially we have to wait some time until we have enough users, and then it starts. So this is the way I would proceed if I want to be on the safe side, if I have a definition in mind that if I can break one message, then the system is broken. So surely one global sequence of mixes won't serve the world. Okay? Further questions, further comments? Okay, any exercises you want to discuss? So here we are, right? So I first have to read it. Compare overlaid sending and mixes. Okay. Mm-hmm. And how far did you get, and what points do you want to discuss?
Okay, so I think I got the answer for the first three points. The first one is regard to security aim. Yes. So I think overlaid sending is mainly aimed at provide the sender anonymity, although it also able to provide receiver anonymity by broadcasting. But the main idea is to provide sender anonymity. And next is it's aimed at protection of communication relationships. Also, it's able to provide sender anonymity and receiver anonymity.
So is sender and recipient anonymity the same as relationship anonymity? How would you compare it? The same. Is this the same? Is this equivalent?
No, I don't think so.
What is the difference? Or the distinction? I would argue if you have sender anonymity and recipient anonymity, what the DC network provides, then of course you don't see who is the sender and you don't see who is the recipient. For all messages you don't see that, except you are the sender of this message or you are the recipient of that message, right? So it's pretty clear that the relationship, who is going to send messages to whom, is protected, except that you are sending messages to yourself. But sending messages to yourself and then being able to trace that you did send a message to yourself, probably I wouldn't call a huge success, right? If we start with relationship anonymity, what does an attacker see? An attacker, assuming we don't have dummy traffic, then an attacker sees, oh, this station is sending. No clue where he is sending to, hopefully. And he sees this set of recipients is receiving. He doesn't know to which of those recipients his message did go from the perspective of the sender, right? From the perspective of the recipient, he knows, oh, I'm getting a message. And there's a set of senders in the corresponding time frame. So I know one of those senders, probably it's the sender of the message I got. Okay. If now we take many, many observations and we assume we don't have dummy traffic, then probably, as seen from a perspective of a sender, it's quite probably always a different set of recipients which receives messages. And now if he's sending to the same address many times, he knows that the message he sent is addressed to some entity which is part of the intersection of all the recipient sets in the different time frames, right? And if you are forming intersections of sets, it's pretty clear it only gets smaller. And if the sets are diverse, or if you're doing an intersection of a large set of sets, then it can well be that in the end you have an intersection of one element, a set of one element, which means the sender knows to whom he did send. Seen from the perspective of the recipient. Okay, I got a message. The message I got comes from this set of senders, right? If I get the next message and somehow I see, hey, the next message I get, it's part of the same transaction. It's coming from the same user. Then I can form the intersection of the sender sets. And I know the message I just got here and there come from the intersection of the senders. And I can do it as long as I know that the messages I got come from the same sender. And of course, somehow I can try to cause the sender to send me further messages. You know that from TV. If you see any movies about tracing calls, and then if someone is called, usually he should make a long conversation with the person calling him, giving time to trace the call. And here it's the same. If we would have dummy traffic, maybe my arguments wouldn't yield the same result. If senders send all the time, because if they have nothing to send and they send dummy traffic, then probably recipients couldn't trace by intersecting anything, because intersecting just because the sets are the same, then intersection is the original set, so no, let's say, added information by doing the intersection. Same for recipients. If we could manage that all recipients receive all the time, then senders, even by repeating to send, wouldn't get information about the recipient. Assuming they don't see how much the recipient receives. So making sure that each recipient receives the same amount of messages, this is tricky. Making sure each sender sends the same amount of messages, that's easy. But I don't want to get too much into details. The main point I want to make is sender anonymity and recipient anonymity together seems to be stronger than relationship anonymity. I'm not arguing it's always stronger, because if you combine it with dummy traffic, the relationship anonymity, maybe you arrive at a system which is equivalent. But in some sense, relationship anonymity is a more risky concept. By those kinds of intersections attack, you can attack it quite easily. And so you need measures to prevent that kind of intersection attacks, which means mainly dummy traffic. Okay, so this was what is the security aim, right? Strength of considered attackers. What did you find out there?
I think overnight sending is against even modifying detectors inside the abelian group. And mixes, according to the aims of the decryption, I think it's only can assume that the attacker cannot control not the real sender or receiver of all the other messages of one batch of mixes, or cannot control all mixes passed by one message. That's about the security.
So in some sense, the number of mixes somehow corresponds to the number of users in the DC network, right? The DC network is broken if I get the cooperation of all but one participants of the DC network. And the mixed network is broken either if I get the same cooperation with respect to the users, or I get the cooperation of all the mixes, right? So yes, so it's comparable. Do you see a relationship? You addressed privacy and anonymity. Surely this is a primary purpose of the mechanism, so we have to start with that. Do you see similarities or dissimilarities with respect to availability? So what can happen or what can be done to bring down a DC network, and what you can do to bring down a mixed network? Bring down means launch a denial of service attack.
I think for DC network is not a very big problem, because some stations bring down, the others can still work.
Let's assume we have a DC network. Let's assume one of the participants is just sending random messages. The effect is nobody can send any message. We had the complicated protocols with the traps to identify that, or at least to make that station lose keys. So in the long run, we can do something against it. But in the short run, it's just a denial of service attack. Quite successful, quite easy. So in some sense, you could frame the DC network as first, the perfect anonymous communication technique, and secondly, you could frame it as the network where a denial of service attack is the most simple. You just send random data. That's it. Okay, in the long run, if we do all the traps and we trace people, etc., we can do something against it, but in the short term, denial of service is so easy, it's really easy. How about mixes?
Well, it's a lot harder because you would have to flood one of the mixes to bring that mix down with message.
So one way would be to try to overload the mixes. If you were a mix, now changing the perspective, what would you do if you get too many messages?
Well, the first mix knows from where messages are coming, so you can just block that receiver that sender.
So if I get all the messages with the same IP address, I would say, okay, I'm taking the first 10, but the rest I'm going to ignore for this batch and etc. So in some sense, flow control between the first mix and the senders could be a solution to the problem. Of course, this assumes that somehow the first mix reliably knows from which sender the message comes. Otherwise, a denial of service attack would be quite easy because I could just attach random IP addresses. Okay, let's assume attaching random IP addresses works. What is then the difference between a denial of service attack on the DC network and a denial of service attack on the mixed network? Surely in both cases we have some effects we don't like to have. So in some sense those attacks are successful then. But is there still a difference?
Well, of course, the attack on the DC network works always. It's just breaking the system, and the attack on the mix approach is just exhausting resources of the mix. So it's a different methodology.
Okay. Okay. I would give two answers. The first answer is the attack on the DC network yields 0 bandwidth for the users. An attack on the first mix, even if the mix is going to discard parts of the traffic or maybe even 99% of the traffic, then still 1% of the traffic makes it. So a denial of service attack on mixes usually isn't 100% successful, maybe 99%. Okay, now of course it depends on the service whether this difference is of some importance or not. Depends. The second answer is, hey, if I'm overloading a mix, could I try to get a faster mix? If yes, nice. Of course, it's not enough to have one mix to get faster. Of course, I have to have all the mixes which are used to get faster. If mixes are special stations, probably this is kind of the usual game. You have to innovate your service, and you have to have faster servers, let's say, each half year or so. If we are overloading or if we are attacking the DC network, does it help to improve technology and have a faster DC network? No, not at all. Okay, so again, I would say there's a slight difference. Of course, with the distributed denial of service attack, usually you can overwhelm any single station. So I wouldn't argue that if a denial of service attack, a distributed denial of service attack is done on a large scale on a mixed network, I wouldn't argue that the difference between the two techniques really is important, but on principle there is some difference.
If that is the case, you could just switch your mixed sequence. I mean, it's not as secure as we just discussed, but you could still do it, and then
Yes.
it's not brought
Yes.
down entirely.
Yes, but in some sense, of course, you could do the same with the DC network. If I see someone is jamming my DC network, so one of the users is working against me, then I could try to get part of another group, hoping that within this other group, nobody is working against me.
The problem is you have to make sure that it's another group. So if you include that user again, it's very easy for that user to bring
Sure.
the DC network down. Whereas with the mixed network, I mean, sending messages costs a lot of resources too.
If it's a kind of distributed denial of service attack, if you are just using not your computer power, but computer power borrowed by others or provided by others who have their machines in an insecure state, then okay. Then I would argue that, okay, if there's a second sequence of mixes, that sequence will be overloaded in the same way. Okay, so this was strength of considered attackers, right? At least some arguments to that. How about effort and flexibility?
OI sending is expensive with regard to the key distribution because
Yes.
every two stations to exchange asymmetric keys. But this can be reduced by using pseudo-random generator.
Okay, so you say if I want to have information theoretic security, by the way, this is another aspect of strength of attacker. In the DC network, we could aim at information theoretic security. In the mixed network, because the middle mixes are to use asymmetric cryptography, it couldn't be information theoretically secure because there's no information theoretically secure asymmetric cryptography, right? So your argument is, if I'm aiming at information theoretically secure crypto, then the exchange of keys is really burdensome because the keys are very, very long. Yes. Okay. Are there other differences in effort?
So in the DC network, you always have to send, even if there's no message you want to send.
Okay, so you have to do some work, even if there's nothing you want to send as a, let's say, true message, yes. Of course, it gets similar to the mixed network. If we say to get relationship anonymity stronger, we need dummy traffic. And then
I think dummy traffic in the mixed network could be generated by the mixes themselves. So the user does not have to send.
okay, I disagree. Let's assume we take the perspective of a recipient who wants to trace senders, the sender of his message. Then, of course, mixes could do some dummy traffic, but assuming the recipient taps the lines to the first mix, game is over. And usually we assume for the DC network and for the mixed network that lines are tapped by the attacker. If the attacker can't tap the lines, then you're argument is okay. But if lines are tapped, I would argue dummy traffic should be end-to-end. If it's only done in the inner parts of the network, if you can tap before and after, dummy traffic doesn't happen. Okay. Any further arguments with respect to effort? How do you upgrade your system? Usually, we all have the feeling that computers and computer networks should get faster because we expect better service, right? 10 years ago, nobody would have thought about video streaming on the internet, right? In the meantime, we do. So how do you upgrade your network? What do you have to do in the DC network? What do you have to do in the mixed network? If you want to have better service in the mixed network, what do you do?
Mixes and the lines between them.
Okay, this surely works. Could you be in a lucky situation that you can get it even with less effort?
Get additional mixes.
Even more simple? Let's assume your mix is not fully loaded. Then you just get a better connection to your first mix and get a faster user station, and then you get better service. Of course, if the mix is fully loaded, then you are both right, then we have to do something about the mixes. But even then, usually you have relatively few mixes, so if the mixes are fully loaded, okay, then the mix providers have to do something, but most other users who don't want to upgrade at the same time, they do nothing, okay? By the way, of course, this is now a risky argument, because if I'm the only person doing a video conference in a network which usually is only supporting audio conferences, so if I'm the only one putting in a stream which is, let's say, an order of magnitude faster than all the other streams, and at some end of the networks there comes a stream out which is 10 times faster than all the other streams, I would assume it's not too hard to guess who is communicating with the large stream to whom, right? Maybe we are not absolutely sure. It could be that this 10 times is demultiplexed and contains 10 smaller streams. And by chance, 10 smaller streams unite and get to the single recipient who gets the large stream. But probably this is less likely than that the large stream makes it as a whole to one of the recipients. So with respect to anonymity, it could be a good idea to say maybe not everyone is upgrading, but at least some part of the crowd, right? Otherwise, using the better services is too risky. How about the DC network, if we want to upgrade? What do we have to do?
You have to upgrade all users because everyone's getting the message.
Yes. That is, your DC network is only as fast as the slowest user. So you have to make sure everyone gets faster. And of course, this sounds much more ambitious than the aim that some servers get faster, or some of your friends who also want to have a video conference get faster. So with respect to effort and scaling, I would say mixes scale better than the DC network. Somehow we have to be cautious with this argument because we shouldn't forget that if you want to have anonymity, you only will have anonymity within the users which have the same computing and sending capacity as you yourself have, except that you restrict your capabilities arbitrarily to get anonymous in a larger set, right? So there's a tricky, subtle part of the argument, but basically mixes are much more flexible. And okay, flexibility is already covered. What is more practicably, in your opinion? What would you build? And why would you argue that way?
No, a mixed network sounds more practical because you don't have to cope with multiple people sending at the same time. It's better protected against people sending just random messages.
I fully agree. So all projects in the past started using the concept of mixes. If it was about strong anonymity at all. Of course, there are many, many projects which only aimed at weak anonymity. For example, the weakest way to do anonymity is you set up one server. You say, hey, I'm the good guy. I'm operating the server. So if you want to be anonymous, please send your traffic to me. I will replace your sender's address and send it further. So this is a classical anonymous proxy, right? If you fully trust that user, that server, then maybe it's a solution, assuming, because messages usually are not encrypted and decrypted, if the lines before and after the server are not tapped. If the lines would be tapped, then you would need link encryption additionally. But in any case, you would trust this single server. What's the risk? Sometimes the police stands in the premises of this operator of the server and says, we want to have your log files, or we want you to do log files, or we want to monitor your traffic. This is not theory. In practice, this happened. And it may be not only the police, it may be the mafia who says, hey, if you don't cooperate with us, think about your family. Or it may be, assume you are head of a secret service. Your aim is to trace the bad guys on the internet who do something they want the public not to know. To which idea would you come? You would say, hey, I'm offering an anonymous communication service. So if you have top secret stuff to send it over my server. Splendid, good idea.
If I'm head of a secret service, I would do that definitely. I would try to get the government to set up a mixed sequence for me and use that.
Okay. Okay. If everybody has understood that having a single server is not enough, then the next step in the game is what you describe. And this is the reason why I, in talking about mixes, emphasized that mixes should be operated and maintained independently. If this is violated, then with respect to operation and maintenance, you have a single server system with the weaknesses a single server system has. Okay? So if you ever decide to use mixes, you should be interested who is operating this machine? Who is operating that machine? And have I reason to believe that those two are not cooperating against me? This is a basic question to be asked. And of course, for 3, 4, 5 mixes, same question, slightly generalized. Okay, I think this was this exercise. Okay. Just to go back a few slides, did you understand why this is sender anonymity? And why, to achieve recipient anonymity, you need an indirect scheme, which then works like this? Is this clear? Because if I want to check whether you really understood how mixes do the work, and if I feel you are a good guy, or no, good guy is wrong at the language level. You are a clever guy, I should say, not a good guy. I should ask, hey, how is recipient anonymity implemented on the mixed network? Because how sender anonymity is implemented, everybody knows. At least if you did follow the course roughly. So is this clear? Then if this is clear, I would assume you could figure out how to have mutual anonymity. And the trick here was that we used a kind of third party where we could query addresses. And addresses are more or less message headers in that version here, which is unobservably transferred. To get it, we need a sender anonymity query and a recipient anonymity reply. And then it may start. Okay, so far, any questions? Okay, if not, we proceed. The first implementations of mixes you might do will have the property that if you are mixing a message, it will get shorter. Why? Encryption for the mix is done in a probabilistic way, so you are encrypting some kind of random number. And the mix will not output this random number. So messages get shorter with each decryption, right? Is this a problem? It depends. If all the messages make it through the mixes in the same way, they go through the same sequence of mixes, if then all the messages get shorter for the same amount of bits in each mix, then I would just say, hey, it's okay. Having shorter messages in the end means better performance. So the first mix then usually has the maximum load, and so the slightly slower mixes should be at the end. It's okay. But if we do some kind of very flexible routing, so each user is choosing his sequence randomly in the limiting case, then that messages change their length is something you wouldn't like to happen. Because it would mean that within your system you would have many, many messages of different length. And you would know how much shorter each message gets in each mix, right? So it's quite natural a question to ask, hey, could we define an encoding scheme and re-encryption scheme such that the length of messages doesn't change? If this can be achieved, choosing mixes randomly is much better supported. So what is the idea? The idea is that each mix takes one block and he receives the address of the next mix. This is to support very flexible routing. If we are using mix cascades, that is, the mixes are fixed, then usually an address of the next mix is not needed. It's pretty clear where to forward the message, and addresses only get some importance if it's the last mix and the message is to be forwarded to the final addressee. And secondly, in the first block, you find a symmetric key. Then you use the symmetric key to decrypt all the other blocks. And since you did process this block and use the content, your message gets one block shorter, so somewhere you have to introduce an additional block. And in this most simple scenario, you agree on some limit where you say, until here, it may be message header blocks, and from here on, it's message content blocks, which means you are allocating the payload of your message in part to the processing by the mixes, to the routing through the mixes, or the encryption stuff the mixes have to do, and the message content you want to transport. And it's pretty clear, the more message content, given an overall fixed length of your message, the more message content, the less hops through mixes you can afford to do. Or vice versa, the more mixes you want to pass, the less message content you can have. And here in the simplest scheme, we are fixing this border. We are fixing the borderline here. And then we can delete this block. Every block here is getting one step ahead. Here we are inserting an additional random block, and we keep the message content blocks at the same position. The good news for this kind of scheme is it works with each crypto system, with each classical crypto system as we define the crypto systems. This is a recursive formulation, and to make clear that this is a scheme which works both for sender anonymity and recipient anonymity, it's pretty clear here the first part, it's decrypted. Why? Going back. The first part is to be decrypted, right? Why? Because we are decrypting everything. So in particular, the first part is to be decrypted, right? Again here, in the message header, the first part is to be decrypted. The message content then is to be encrypted. So here, the first part is to be decrypted all the time. It's true for sender anonymity, and it's true for recipient anonymity. The content has to be decrypted if it's about sender anonymity, and it has to be encrypted if it's about recipient anonymity. So maybe here we have to switch the encryption or decryption operation. So everybody has to know where to switch it. Therefore, this is a global property to be known in the message format. The next question is, can we avoid, I'm going back, to have this kind of borderline? Which means if you have this borderline, it's a static borderline between how many mixes to use and how much message content we could have. Can we make that flexible? Can we make that dynamic in the sense that if a sender just has a feeling I want to have more mixes to be used, but I have less message content, then it would be possible for that station to decide on this? The answer is yes, we can do that, we can achieve it if our encryption systems we are using have some additional properties. Here, I only use the standard properties of symmetric and asymmetric encryption systems. For the more flexible scheme, I require or I need the properties that for messages, it doesn't matter whether I'm encrypting first and later on decrypting, or whether I'm decrypting first and later on encrypting. If this property is provided, for example, the one-time pad has this property, the pseudo one-time pad has this property, so there are encryption systems, at least there are symmetric encryption systems who have that property. Okay? So if we have that property, then we could, here in this part, leave everything as we had it, even in this part, and could inject blocks with random content at the end of the message. So everybody, each mix, adds the block we are going to lose here, to delete here, as a random block at the end, which means the mix has no need to know that the borderline is here. In the slide before, the mix had to know where the borderline is because he had to inject the random block just before the borderline. Otherwise, it would either override content or override, if this is the first time to be used, or override maybe blocks needed for addressing of mixes and for the hybrid encryption in mixes. Here, you just add up, or you just insert the block at the very end. No need to know where the borderline is here, which in other words means this borderline can be adapted by each user as he or she likes. Okay. Still here, all the discussion was assuming we have block ciphers. So mainly we talked about encrypting or decrypting blocks. How does it look like if you think about stream ciphers? If we try not to waste any bits, and with stream ciphers usually we are much more flexible to adapt the length of the ciphertext to the message content. And everything we did here with respect to blocks, we might do here with respect to streams of bits, stream ciphers. So here again, leading bits to be decrypted, you get the symmetric key, the next address, and some rest. You put it here. This was the message content, and here we have random contents, and we append the appropriate number of bits here. Okay, so far schemes which maintain the length of messages and in each step gets more flexible or more efficient. Do you have any questions? Okay, then I would say until here we have the main message formats for mixes. I don't expect you to learn everything by heart. Okay, if you ever need it, you will look it up, I assume. But you should understand what's the principles behind it. The next question is, or the next topic is, can we use each crypto system, each asymmetric crypto system for mixes? Or are there cryptographic systems which, when used for end-to-end encryption or whatever, are okay, but for mixes they aren't? In general, this question is really hard to answer. I would say in general, a mix is really pushing the demands on security of the crypto system to its limits. Why? Because a mix, by definition, just has to accept each message, to process it, and to output the result. When we talked about active attacks on users of cryptography, often you gave me the impression, how could someone be so stupid to get a ciphertext, decrypt it, and then output the result, right? This sounded completely silly. How could you so stupid to decrypt and then output what you got? I tried to give you some motivation for debugging purposes. If it doesn't work out, finally you will send the whole dump of your main memory to someone who's willing to debug your implementation, I assume. By the way, maybe this is what Microsoft or Apple asks permission for if one of your application crashes and they ask, should we send an error message to Microsoft or Apple? I have no clue what is contained in that error message. It could be a completely dump of your main memory. So usually I decline this because I have no clue whether some of my secrets are in plain text still in the main memory and whether this is transmitted. Okay, so I tried to convince you in the past that active attacks in cryptography are realistic. But if I looked into your faces, some kind of doubt remained, at least in some faces, which I understand. But now with the mixes, we have a kind of functionality where active attacks work by definition. Because a mix has to take a message, he has to process it, and he has to output the result. So a former student of mine, Manfred Böttger, said mixes are nothing but ideal victims of active attacks. That's a splendid good definition of mix. Okay. So it's pretty clear, with mixes, we really need good crypto. Crypto which is withstanding active attacks. Now it gets very, very particular. When I started my research in mixes and in cryptography, RSA surely was a state-of-the-art system. And when David Chaum originally did write his famous article about mixes, RSA mainly was the only alternative what to use, or at least the main alternative what to use. So we came across the question, if you use RSA in a very straightforward way to implement mixes, is this secure? And as we shall see, the answer is it's not secure. What is the reason? The reason is, with RSA, there are active attacks. Maybe we should go back. That now I probably need the first part of the presentation. So maybe I should look for RSA. Okay, this was not a good idea because it's now changing the presentation. So let's give it a second try. And then I'm looking by hand, or searching by hand. So what did we have here? We had attacks on RSA. And what did we have? We used a kind of factor to multiply. This factor, of course, was somehow prepared. So we take y to the power of c. C was a public exponent. And later on, we could divide by y. And we received the plaintext x. So this was the kind of active attack we had. So form a factor appropriately, take the y, raise it to the power of c, multiply, and then if it's decrypted, you get as output the product. of the plaintext you are looking for and the factor why you did just choose. The same strategy is applied to mixes. So we take a plaintext, we take a ciphertext, which later on will get M, and we take the same ciphertext, multiply it with a factor taken to the power of C. And mainly as output, we will get the message multiplied by the factor, but this is only mainly or roughly. Why? Because with mixes, we had this probabilistic encryption. We had those random numbers which make it into the encryption but are not output. Therefore, the attack, the multiplicative attack on RSA, as you learned it in the first part of the lecture, or at least in the first part of the presentation, does not work in a very simple way. If you just do it, it won't work. But, and this was the idea, is this what will be output close enough, related enough to M times F to be discovered? And here the answer is yes, it is. And this we will do after the break, because it will take us, let's say, a quarter of an hour just to go through the formula and to understand it. So today we are very much on time with our break, 20 minutes, and then we go a little bit into the mathematics and understand how it's done. Okay. So I hope the main idea that we have a kind of multiplicative attack. This is something you just reloaded into your working memory, I hope. And now let's see how it's working in detail. To look at it in more detail, somehow we have to give names to some of parameters to be able then to do some interpretation of messages or random numbers, encryption, decryption, as residue classes. So we fix that the length of the random number Z is small b, and that the length of the message M is capital B. So usually small b is much smaller, maybe it's 100 bits, then capital B, usually if we have a modulus length of, let's say, 2000 bits, which is a common modulus length with RSA today, then capital B would be 1900. So, how does the attack work? The attacker taps a ciphertext. He takes the ciphertext, takes a factor F. Usually we think of F as being a rather small factor. Let's say 2, 3, 4, 10, maybe 117 to the power of C. Multiplies it and puts it, for example, in the same batch. Then the attacker looks at all the outputs and of course he has no clue which of the outputs corresponds to this input message. And initially he has no clue what of the output corresponds to his input, the product he did input. But he knows roughly if there are two outputs which are different by a factor f, or which are roughly different by a factor f, then these are the two outputs which correspond to this input and that input. So this is the idea. And now we need some mathematics to clarify what it means roughly the message times the factor. So this is now what we are talking about. First remark. I didn't spell out exactly which factors f to consider. Even if these factors have, let's say, not too many bits or too many digits, it can be that it's very many factors. So here we had 100 bits. Let's assume we take for the factor 20 bits, then still it's many, many possible values. That is, this and this is unlinkable for the mix if many factors f are possible. Because if now we are discussing about counter strategies as well, of course you could say, hey, let's enhance the mix by some test whether any of its inputs are related by something, some factor f taken to the power c. And if they are related, those inputs, then the mix should ignore the second input. But this strategy, of course, wouldn't work if there are too many possibilities to just check for that. Next, it's pretty clear if this is the message format we have, then 2 to the power of small b times 2 to the power of big B should be smaller or equal than n minus 1, because both the random number and the message part should fit into an RSA block. So taken together, they should still be smaller than the modulus. A similar condition as what I did right here is that b plus capital B should be smaller or equal than the length of n. As I already mentioned, small b is usually much smaller than capital B. Now we assume that the random bit strings, the random numbers z, are the most significant bits. So we prepend them to the message. Of course, we could do differently. We could append them to the message. But just to get concrete, let's assume we prepend it. So let's assume the random bit strings are at the most significant bit positions. Then we can write the message random number concatenated with message m as random number times 2 to the capital B, this was the length of the message, plus m. This is just the numerical value of these two concatenated bit strings, right? And of course, or we can do the same. We take z times m multiplied, z and m multiplied with factor f. So we just put in Zm, it's this, so we put it in, times f. So we take first part of the sum times f, second part of the sum times f. So easy. And now we, if you take this as a notation, we again have to fit this product into the message format we are using. The message format var is the first small b bits are the random number, and the next capital B bits are the message. So if we are multiplying by a factor, we are interested in what new random number arises, what new message arises. And this is what we do next. So let the identifiers z prime and m prime be defined by that this product interpreted as a number yields the new random number times 2 to the power of capital B plus m prime. So we already did some calculation what this is. So this was z times 2 to the power of b times f plus m times f. And this has to be equal to what we just had. So this we can, or this equation, this congruence, we can simplify slightly by just putting the terms which contain 2 to the power of capital B. It's this term and that term to the left, and doing all the other terms to the right. So 2 to the power of B minus z prime, so minus z prime, and here we have z times f. So at the left we have 2 to the power of capital B times z times f minus z prime. And all the other terms we take to the right, so we keep m prime, and we have to say minus m times f. And now we divide by 2 to the power of capital B. So at the left, this is what stays, and here we have to divide. And now we want to have some kind of interval where we know that this part and what is the same that part is in. So can we give, if you look at this, some lower limit and some upper limit, and then we have an interval where it's in. So what is the smallest value this can take? The smallest value is that what counts positive is 0, and what counts negative is maximal, right? So what was the maximal value of the random number? It was 2 to the power of small b. So the minimum value here is minus 2b. When is it maximal? It's maximal if we are not subtracting anything, and if we take z as large as possible. And let's assume that we are choosing f within the same interval as the random number, just to keep our calculation simple. And by the argument that if we're choosing f in the same interval, then the security level is somehow balanced. I'm going back one slide. We said this random number is long enough just to prevent complete search, right? So now if we are talking about how many possible values do we need for f to make it, for practical purposes, unlinkable, then it is a very good argument to say, hey, for f, we should have the same number of possible values as we have for the random number. Because the random number, we assume, is taken from a domain you can't search through. So should be f taken from a domain you couldn't search through. Okay, so I'm going to the next slide. So it's a pretty good assumption saying f should be in the same domain as the random number. So if both the random number and f are smaller or equal than 2 to the power of small b, this means, assuming this is 0, that it's smaller than 2 to the 2 small b. So this is let's say a lower and upper bound for this value, and this means it's a lower and upper bound for this. So what would an attacker do? We, going back, have the output of the batch. Initially, the attacker has no clue what is yellow here and what is red. He only knows if I take the yellow one and the red one, mainly I will have some relationship between the two. And hopefully the relationship is such that if I take any other pair of values, the relationship doesn't hold. Okay. So the attacker replaces in this equation the formal parameters m and m prime by all output message pairs of the batch. So you put into the formal parameters all possible values which are output here. And then you form this difference. You divide by this number. And then you get a value for this where you know that if it's the correct m prime and the correct m, then this value has to be in this interval. So the attacker puts in and checks whether the outcome is in the appropriate interval. And this equation 2 holds if b is much smaller than capital B, very probably only for one pair. I call the pair P1, P2. And if it holds for pair P1, P2, then P1 is the output corresponding to the message Zm to the power of C. This is yellow. And P2 is the corresponding output to the message times the factor raised to the appropriate exponent. You do a search through all the pairs. And if only one outcome is in this interval, which is quite likely, then you did succeed. Then you know this is the output of yellow, and that is the output of red. If you don't succeed, which means there is more than one value pair, which gives this result, then what do? If your first try fails, what do? You give it a second try, right? So you are choosing another factor. Of course, you cannot make sure that your second try makes it into the same batch, because usually this batch is processed. But as long as the mix doesn't change the public key and its secret key, which corresponds to its public key, as long as this is the case, you just input your second try into another batch. And now, of course, if you are talking about pairs, now you take the first part of your pair in the first batch, and you take the second part of your pair out of the second batch, right? And this usually should work. So this means if you are using RSA in a very straightforward way for implementing mixes, then the multiplicativity of RSA, even if you randomize RSA, even if you do probabilistic encryption using RSA, still the multiplicativity is dominantly enough to break it. When Birgit Fitzmann and myself yielded that result, it was really surprising for us. By the way, it all started that I made a mistake. Because sometimes I read about or learned about this kind of multiplicative attack, and then I usually completely forgot that we had to deal with the random numbers. So my first feeling was, oh, RSA, multiplicativity. So we do in a factor, a product with a factor, and then we get this out, and that's it. It's broken. And then Birgit said, oh, Andreas, maybe the idea is right, but in concrete, it's wrong. You did forget this and that. And then, of course, the next try was to say, okay, yes, I did forget it. Sorry. But still, if you take that into account, does it work nevertheless? And it worked. And okay, so we did write a paper about it. Okay, do you have any questions? Just to make clear what I expect from you, I would hope that everybody got the very idea. What is the idea of the attack? And I would hope that somehow you could communicate the idea. What I don't expect is that you learn all these formulas by heart, because there's no value in learning those formulas by heart. If you need them, either you take some time to develop them for yourself, but usually an oral examination is much too short to do this, or you look it up. But the idea, I think, is interesting, because it brings me back to a statement I once made that if an encryption system has any additional property except being able to encrypt and decrypt, then this puts this crypto system at risk. We had that with the multiplicative attacks with RSA, and it still works with mixes even if probabilistic encryption is used. So the very generic warning, hey, if there are additional properties, you really have to think about how they can be misused. This once again showed up to be a very real warning, a very relevant warning. So this is mainly what I want to communicate to you. So I don't prevent you, the aim is not to prevent you to implement mixes with RSA in the wrong way. Okay, hopefully you avoid that. But this is not the real risk in life you face, because usually nobody of you will implement a mix. And even if you do so, I'm not sure whether you will implement a mix with RSA. But probably, whenever you work with cryptography, and if someone comes up and says, hey, this crypto system, in addition to be able to and decrypt, has this and that kind of algebraic property, then you should start thinking, hey, what does this really mean? And this is what I want to convey to you. And I have the feeling to give you your own judgment that this is really a risky thing. I have to deliver examples. Because I can always say, hey, I give you a warning about this and that. I could warn you against everything. The question is, do I have examples which exemplify that a warning is valid and necessary? Because usually in life you will hear so many warnings that you tend to ignore them. I remember one dialogue with my father, who once asked me, 20 years ago I gave you a warning. Why didn't you listen to that? And I said, Daddy, 20 years ago and the years before, you gave me so many warnings. I just decided to ignore them because it was just too much. And so it would have been better if you would have concentrated on the really important warnings. And then he said, oh yes, but I felt all the warnings somehow were true. So, okay. So I want to give you some impression that you can judge whether a warning is really valid or it's just, okay. So this was the aim of these two slides, okay? So clear what I expect from you, and hopefully as well clear that no need to learn all these formula by heart, right? I didn't learn them by heart either, so I can't expect you to do it. Okay? Any questions so far? Okay. As always, when we introduced an anonymity technique, we have to discuss what does this mean for availability. Pretty clear, if you are using mixes, if we made clear that we are using these mixes, these sequence of mixes, if any of those mixes fails, we have a problem, right? So what could we do? If one of the mixes fails, we could use other mixes, okay? Does this work out well? Okay, we had a discussion about security, so probably you have the feeling it might be doable, but maybe not a splendid good idea to do. Probably this is what you kept in your head, what we discussed 2 hours ago. I have even a more specific thing to see. When can you use other mixes easily? You can use other mixes easily. It's about sender anonymity. The sender can choose, depending on the current state of the mixes, which mixes to use. And if the sender is not absolutely stupid, usually he will not choose a mix which is down. Right? If it's a scheme about recipient anonymity, it's completely different. The recipient did form the return address. Maybe he did so depending on the current state of mixes at the time of forming the return address. Then somehow he did send the return address to the sender, who will later on use it. It may be hours later, maybe even weeks or months later, that you are using a return address. And in the meantime, the state of mixes may have changed dramatically. So with return addresses, at the very least, we have the problem that the mix may be down, he may be unoperational, but we need it. Otherwise, the return address isn't working. So this is a real problem. So at least for return addresses, we have to discuss how to deal with the situation that one or several mixes may be out of operation. What we can do. One way is to say, okay, if I have a normal sequence of mixes, mix 1 to 5, which I usually use, I could just make sure I have additional sequences of mixes I might use. Here, for example, as an alternative, I have a mix sequence mix 6 until mix 10. If the first sequence failed, I could use the second one. If the second one fails, of course, I could use the third one here, mix 11 until mix 15. Of course, if the third one fails as well, then I have a problem, because I have not a fourth one. Of course, now you may continue and having a fourth one and so on, but you will have a limited set of mix sequences, and if all of them fail, you have a problem. When does a mix sequence fail? A mix sequence fails in this scenario if at least one of the mixes within this sequence fails. So when does this scheme work? If at least one of the mix sequences is such that all of the mixes are working at the same time, or roughly at the same time. How about privacy? One is this kind of approach insecure in the sense that sender or recipient anonymity isn't there. What do you need to break relationship anonymity? You need one of the three sequences to be broken with respect to anonymity. So either 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 together could break it, or 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 together could break it, or 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 together could break it. That is, with any additional path you have, which increases availability, you are decreasing anonymity. This is a trade-off we had several times with other techniques, right? By the way, there are, of course, some alternatives. I framed it here. First, we try 1 to 5. Next, we try 6 to 10. Then, if this fails as well, we try 11 to 15. Of course, if you are in a hurry, if you are not willing to wait, if you are not really patient. And by the way, I don't know many people who are very patient, at least no computer scientists. So if you are in a hurry, you could say, okay, I try it in parallel. I send my message here, I send it here, and I send it here. And whichever way it makes it first to the recipient gets it. So this is to keep delays at a minimum. But of course, it's using the most resources, because now you are doing the processing 3 times. And of course, if mixes may be overloaded by that, what I framed as, hey, this is saving the most time, this is the fastest version, may not be the fastest version if mixes are just overwhelmed by too much processing needs, by too many replicated paths. Okay? What is good with this technique? It's good that each mix operates completely independently. What mix 3, for example, does not depend on any other mix. If mix 3 gets an input, it's going to decrypt or encrypt the message part and put it out. No need to coordinate with any other mix. Okay. Now we look at the next variant. Here I depicted a variant where I said mixes may replace each other. That is, mix 1, if mix 1 fails, may be replaced by mix 1 prime, or may be replaced by mix 1 double prime. Sounds nice, because the sender has no need to care about alternate paths. Here, the sender has to handle, there's this possibility, there's that possibility, there's that possibility. Would, for example, mean that the format of return addresses has to be extended to cover several disjoint paths. Here, very easy. You make sure that your message makes it to one of the 3 mixes. Either 1 prime, or 1 double prime. You don't care which of the 3 mixes is up. It doesn't change. Those mixes can replace each other. They basically share the secret key for decryption. Sounds nice, much easier to use, but mixes have to make sure that each message is only processed once, not twice, and not even 3 times. So these 3 mixes have to coordinate to make sure that each message is only processed by one of them. And this property has to be maintained even if 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 of these mixes fail. So if everything is up and running, it's straightforward how you implement it. You say, hey, in a team of 3, we have got a message for processing. So let's agree who is doing the job. I propose I do the job. So please, you two, tell me you are not doing the job. Then I'm doing the job. Then it's clear what's to be done. Okay, if I get confirmation from two of you, my co-mixes, Andreas, you do the job. Okay, I do. Nice. But what do I do if I don't get an answer from you? How long should I wait? If I wait long enough, am I certain that you are down? Or may there be an attacker who is just isolating us from each other? Both mixes are running, but some attacker makes sure we can't communicate. Not easy to decide. Even if I could decide you are down, can I make certain whether you did process this message before you went down? And maybe the message to me never made it to me, where you ask me, please, Andreas, don't process this message. But you didn't hear from me for quite some time, so you decided you do the job. So you see, this kind of coordination is not easy. And of course, if you now proceed and say we have not only mix 1, but mix 2, 3, 4, 5, same procedure for each mix. So the trade-off is here, sender and recipient have to administer the redundancy. They have to administer the additional mixes, the additional paths. Here, use is much more easy, but the mixes have to administer who is doing the job and who's not. Of course, these are not the only two variants we have. We could play around with who might replace whom endlessly. Whenever you look into an organization, you can make so many plans. Who is going to replace whom? So here I did depict that I have a scheme where the sender could send to the first mix, the first mix could send to the second mix, etc., etc. So there's a possibility just to do it ordinarily. But in addition, the encryption scheme can be made up in the sense that each one, the sender and the mixes, can jump over one station. So instead of using mix 1, which is what I should do if mix 1 is working, if I'm the sender, I could send my message to mix 2 directly, because I have not only the representation at my discretion, which is for mix 1, but I have in addition the representation at my discretion, which is for mix 2. And same for mix 1. Mix 1 should not only have the representation at his discretion for mix 2, he should also have the representation for mix 3, and so on and so forth. And of course, you can generalize that it's not only possible to jump over one mix, but to jump over a certain number of mixes. And here you see what this means with respect to administration of keys. So mix 1, for example, by decryption with the secret key D1, should not only get the key K1, this is a key he should usually use for processing his message and send it to mix 2, but he in addition gets key K2, which is the key mix 2 usually should get for processing the message. So if this is done, mix 1 could not only process it for the next mix, but using K2, it could also process it for mix 3. And of course, you could make sure that if mix 1 does not only get K1 and K2, but K3 as well, then he could generate the representation of the message which should arrive at mix 4. and so on and so forth. And again, if some station can do a kind of decryption another station normally should do, so somehow stations can replace each other with respect to functionality, then again we need coordination, making sure this decryption with the symmetric keys, or maybe with respect to content, even the encryption with the symmetric key, only takes place once. Okay, this is fault tolerance. Maybe first, do you have questions? Okay, then somehow I would like to sum up the basic methods we had for anonymous communication. So the methods we had was mainly ring networks, that is unobservability of neighboring lines and stations, and digital signal regeneration. We had the DC network, and we had the mixed network. And I want to compare these networks with respect to security, which mainly means secure against which attacker. That is, what is the underlying attacker model. And we want to compare it with respect to the expense. How expensive is it to build and use such a network? Okay, let's start with the ring network. What is the attacker model? The attacker model was the attacker should not tap too many lines. In particular, it should not tap exactly before and exactly after a station. So somehow I would say that we assume the attacker is physically limited. He cannot tap each channel. What are the expenses? And I should frame what are the expenses per user. If I have n stations, so n is the number of users, then the expense to send a message grows linearly with the number of users. Why? Because the message has to make it one time around the ring. So it has to be forwarded n times. This means it has to be sent n times. If we say for recipient anonymity, we are not insisting on broadcast, but the recipient may replace what he just got by something he wants to send, for example, to build up a duplex channel within one channel. Then the transmission expense is only n half. Then it's not n times, but it's only multiplied by n half, because on average the message has to travel half around the ring. And then on the way backward, the other half. What does this mean? Red means, this is my color interpretation, but this is how I use colors. Usually red means I feel unhappy. It's not good. If your expense building a network, your expense per user grows linear with the number of users, it means overall this is a quadratic expense. doesn't sound good. So let's look to the DC network. First, the attacker model. If we build the DC network in the most secure way, that is, we are using long random keys, no pseudo-randomly generated keys, but like in the one-time pad, long keys. If we do the bit commitments for the reservations, so the commitments for the traps, in a way that even a computationally unlimited attacker cannot open the trap differently, then we get sender anonymity in an information theoretic sense. We get it, as some people would say, unconditionally, without any assumptions we have to make, except of the usual assumptions within cryptography. If you are generating random numbers, the numbers you're generating are really random, which is not so trivial as it sounds, because usually generating random numbers means you have a special purpose chip, and if this chip doesn't produce random numbers, you have a problem. So this is the green part. We could do the DC network in a very, very, very secure way. And the only limitation I gave here is that if you do the bit commitment schemes in the way I just described, so it cannot be changed, then this means, as I mentioned, an attacker which is unlimited with respect to computing power can open it in the sense he gets to know what the committed value is. That is, an attacker then could see this is a trap, or this is a non-trap. That is, an attacker who is computationally unrestricted could break service delivery. Or putting it the other way around, service delivery can only be guaranteed against the computationally restricted attacker. So this is the DC network in the most secure way. I have to admit it's expensive to implement because we really need long keys. Of course, we could replace the very long keys by pseudo-random generators for keys. Then the DC network only is computationally secure, so it's only secure against the computationally restricted attacker. And depending on what kind of pseudo-random generator you're using, it could be that the system you're using is cryptographically strong because you are using some generator where you can prove something about its security. Or you could use something which is well analyzed, but you don't have any proof about its strength, except that it's well analyzed and nobody did find flaws. What is the expense? In the DC network, again, for one message to be transmitted, n users have to add up keys, and if they have a message to send, their message, transmit it, and then it's added up globally. So for each message, you have a factor, an expense, which is O of n, capital O of n. If you look at pairwise superposed receiving. That is, you could realize sending and receiving in the same channel, then maybe you gain a factor of 2. Then it's not a factor of n, but a factor of n half you incur. But only for particular situations. So this was the expense read the transmission. In addition, you have to do key exchange and key superposition. If you have n users, and if we assume that k is a parameter which gives us the connectedness in the key graph in the DC network, then the number of keys we are dealing with is k times n. Now, of course, it depends on how large k is. In the limiting case, you could choose k to be n. And then, of course, it gets really expensive, because now we are talking about the fully connected key graph. But to sum up, the problem with the DC network is that the transmission expense is really high. It doesn't scale well, as we discussed in the exercise we did in the beginning of this lecture. Let's look at the mixed network. The attacker model here is mainly the attacker has to be computationally restricted, because middle mixes, that is the second, third, until the last but one mix, have to use asymmetric cryptography. So those mixes only work, only are useful against an attacker who is computationally restricted. The first mix, who knows the sender, could use the one-time pad with each of the sender. And the last mix with each of the recipients could use a one-time pad as well. So if you are willing to trust as a sender the first mix, and if you are willing as a recipient to trust the last mix completely, then you get information theoretic security. But you have to trust the first mix fully, or you have to trust the last mix fully. And this is usually something we say, hey, this is not what we like. Because if you have a single entity you are trusting fully, then okay, just make that to a kind of central server within your distributed system, put all your trust in that station, and then you get a very, very simple solution to all your problems. But still, of course, it might be useful because it's possible and maybe it's not costing too much to let the first mix and the last mix use the one-time pad. But still, I wouldn't argue that now we have an overall anonymity mechanism which is information theoretically secure. It's only if you assume it's the first mix is good or the last mix is good. So mixes are computationally restricted. More particularly, the attacker model for mixes usually assumes that the attacker is computationally restricted. But what is even more, I'm not sure whether we have for mixes well analyzed asymmetric encryption systems. I showed you the example that using RSA in a very straightforward way, even as a probabilistic system for mixes, didn't work out well. Most cryptographic systems are not tested against arbitrary active attacks because many people assume they won't happen in practice. I argue against that already in the cryptography part, but most people don't do that. I always try to be on the safe side, but being on the safe side is a good thing as long as you're giving a lecture. If you're to build a system, then always trying to be on the safe side gets much more demanding and may end up with that you never ever get your system finished, which of course is also a kind of denial of service attack, right? I could argue that this is the usual denial of service attack everybody launches if doing software engineering, but okay, shouldn't stress that too much. And, so mixes have their weakest point that they are using asymmetric cryptography in a way which is not the standard way asymmetric cryptography is used. So usually in asymmetric cryptography, what is the security property you want to have? Someone getting the ciphertext has no clue about the plain text. What did I do here? I can't tell you what is the meaning of M. It's not about the secrecy of M. All I needed to do to break the mix is find a kind of relationship between M and M times F, or roughly M times F. So here I was not breaking RSA in the sense, hey, give me the ciphertext, I'm giving you the plain text. The attack here was, hey, I have two somehow related ciphertexts. Could I find a corresponding relationship between the plain texts? This is subtly different than what is usually the security property of asymmetric cryptographic systems. So, to emphasize this, mixed networks still need a lot of cryptographic research. And I'm not sure whether all the cryptographers really are interested in these properties. Usually they are interested in protecting the content of communication. This is their primary business. But here we want to use asymmetric cryptography for some different purpose. So this is the weak point with mixes. The good point with mixes is, hey, the expense is much less. So if I want to send a message, what do I have to do? I have to send a message, and this message is sent further k times. If k is not only the connectedness of the key graph of the DC network, but it's also the number of mixes. And now, if I look at the user, the single user, what is his expense? The user is not going to forward the message k times. This is the mix is doing this stuff. The user is sending a message to the first mix, right? Nothing more, nothing less. So the question comes up, is this message to the first mix longer than it would be if no mixes would be used? And the answer is yes, it is slightly longer. Why? because of the probabilistic encryption. For all the middle mixes, we need probabilistic asymmetric encryption. That is, the message gets longer by at least 100 bits. Therefore, we could argue that, okay, for each mix, the message gets longer, so the length of each message grows proportionally to the number of mixes. But I have to admit it only grows slowly. Per mix, it's 100 bits, maybe. Which is, if you think about 10 mixes and a message of a megabyte, then, okay, 10 times 100 bits, it's, okay, forget it. That is, in theory, each message surely grows linearly with the number of mixes. It's O of k. But practically, often, this growth is not significant. Therefore, roughly, I say the message stays as it is. To send one message, you just have to send one message. And this is the transmission on the so-called last mile. This is the transmission the end user has to do. And because usually doing transmission in the fixed network doesn't cost you anything because everyone has a flat rate, if you do a transmission on the radio network, the last mile, the hop to the next station, this is what you pay for. The rest is free. If you look to the expenses within the core network, then of course, first, messages get longer with the number of mixes. This was O of k. And each mix has to retransmit the message, right? So this gives another factor of k. So this, in theory, is O of k squared. Since I argued here that practically messages don't grow much, in practice, often it's not OK squared, which is really dominating, but it's only k, not k squared. So this is an overview over the techniques we have. If you look at it, if you want to go for utmost security, you will end up with a DC network. But the problem you have is transmission is high, is costly. And in addition, we have to say that a denial of service attack, at least in the short term, is really easy to do. If you look for efficiency, if you cannot afford sending too many bits around, then probably you would end up with using a mixed network. The price you pay is that mainly you will use cryptography, where cryptography might turn out to be the weak point. Usually, I always argue that usually cryptography is not the weak point in designing a secure system, because usually cryptography is much better engineered and much better understood than the operating systems you are using. Here, with respect to mixes, I should be more modest and should mention, okay, could be that the cryptography we are using is not so strong as we hope it to be. I just try to be frank and not just criticizing some people with the respect of the outcome of their work and then pretending, hey, we do it that way, and of course we are completely mastering all the uncertainty we manage. Okay, there might be a problem. Okay, do you have questions so far? I think this kind of overview is a very important overview if you want to compare the different basic methods. So you should really understand what's on this slide. Do you have questions? Okay, if not, then I should talk a little bit about layers. What is a layer? First, I should mention there are very different kinds of layers. You could say in a device like this, you have different layers of interpretation and execution. At the basic layer, you have some kind of processing unit at the hardware level, which executes some instructions. Maybe on top of that, you have a micro-programmed execution unit. So what the hardware is executing is micro-instructions. And the micro-instruction layer you have is executing something which is maybe assembler code, is meshing instructions. So one kind of layering is the lower layer executes the higher layer, right? And this is not what I'm talking about now. In networking, we also have layers. But there, the lower layers don't execute the higher layers. But the lower layers provide a service, a communication service, which is used by the higher layers to add value, to add additional properties. So this is the kind of layering in communication. The most well-known model about communication and layering is the so-called OSI model, or OSI model, Open System Interconnection model, where we have the following terminology. Layer N doesn't have to look at data units of layer N plus 1. So we have layer N plus 1, and below we have layer N. And this layer N has no need to look at the data units of the higher layer. So the lower layer, because it has no need to look at the data layer, doesn't notice or should not notice if the data unit of the higher layer is encrypted. So usually in the model you learn there's no need to look at the data unit. And if you are talking about security, I would like to hear there's no possibility to look at the data unit. Maybe I should make some jokes just to make the point more clear. Sometimes people called switching methods according to different criteria, and one switching method was switching by selective listening. So you do some kind of routing because some stuff you are just ignoring, you're not paying attention. So this is usually what I do as a human being if I get into a room and many conversations are going on. Switching by selective listening. Maybe I only can concentrate on one conversation. Is this a security technique? No, not really. First, I could try to focus on any of the conversations according to my decision. And secondly, probably if I could do a recording, I could try to listen into different conversations one after the other, right? Okay, so switching by selective listening probably isn't a good approach. Or another buzzword you hear is, or a large political debate we had, or we have, is deep packet inspection. Probably you heard that buzzword, right? You often hear it in the surrounding of net neutrality. So should the net be neutral to the content it's transporting? I think there are good arguments that it should be neutral, at least as far as we are. The tremendous success of the internet is that the internet takes all the traffic and treats it equally. Sometimes I'm upset about that because I think my traffic is more important than your traffic, so I would like to get better service if I pay for it. But probably if you also have the feeling that your traffic is more important than my traffic, so you would be willing to be paying for it, so in the end, what is the difference? We are paying for something. That's the difference, but we don't get better service. Okay, it's a slightly black and white argument. I could discuss more deeply in shades of gray, but okay, deep packet inspection. Some carriers want to do just to see, hey, this is this kind of traffic, so it should be forwarded fast, or this is another kind of traffic, for example, email or file transfer, so it could be delayed in case of a shortage in resources. So when sometimes I'm in Berlin and sometimes members of the German parliament ask me, hey, what do you think about deep packet inspection? And the answer as a security guy is, I don't want to discuss whether deep packet inspection is good or bad. All I can tell you is, if deep packet inspection is possible, then your system is insecure. Then they get very, very large eyes and ask, okay, so maybe we should understand what deep packet inspection is. Oh, yes, this is a good idea. Secondly, what do you mean by security, and why do you feel that looking into the packets means insecurity? Okay, now a longer discussion starts. So, coming back to our model. In the very model, we learn that the data unit, the value of the data unit is not needed to provide the service of the lower layer. It should not be taken into consideration in providing the service of the lower layer. It should be opaque. The lower layer shouldn't care about it. And if we are talking about security, we should make sure that the lower layer cannot take care. We should encrypt it. By the way, this is supporting net neutrality, maybe. But the main point, it's a confidentiality argument. And of course, if we go further, so at layer N we have a header and maybe a trailer, and this again together gets the data unit of the next lower layer. And again, the lower layer shouldn't care about the data unit of the higher layer. So what should we do? Encrypt again. So in the limiting case, whenever you go from one layer to the next lower layer, you should encrypt. First statement, it's possible. Second statement is, depending on your implementation, it really might be a good idea. Why? if you don't encrypt, if you do not the right encryption, what does the lower layer get? It gets the header of the upper layer and the trailer. The header might tell, hey, which service is used, who is using the service, etc., etc., etc. If you don't encrypt it, the lower layer can tap that. And it's pretty clear, if you are sending your traffic through the internet, many routers, many telcos will record all information they can get about you. Why? Because you might be a terrorist. And it's always a good idea fighting terrorists, isn't it? And make sure the terrorists are really using the internet. Don't allow them not to use the internet. If you can make that sure, okay, everything is fine with me. But I'm not pretty sure whether terrorists are so stupid that they are using this kind of network without taking appropriate precautions. And I would argue, and this is what I tell people in Berlin, that there are radio techniques, spectrum techniques from the military, where if it's about coordinating smaller groups of people, then you can do it by radio. No need to use public networks, no need to use the internet. So if I would really be a terrorist, I wouldn't use the internet. By the way, some politicians and some security agencies say, Mr. Fitzman, we are well aware that you are right, but if we can't trace the real terrorists, then at least we are going to trace the population, otherwise we are losing our jobs. Because if we can't trace anybody, then for what purpose are we paid? But usually they only tell this if no camera is running in the room. What I, as a human being, fully understand. Okay, so what do we learn with respect to layered systems? In the limiting case, whenever you go one layer down, you encrypt. And when you did so, whenever you go the corresponding layer up, you have to decrypt. How does this look like? Here, I was somehow selective when to encrypt and when to decrypt. Here in this picture, I didn't do it between each and every layer. I was selective in the sense that I said I want to do it twice. I want to do end-to-end encryption, and I want to do link encryption. These are the two measures we learned, and where should I do it? End-to-end encryption, as the name tells us, should be some encryption we do which stays valid until it's arriving at the other user station. So end-to-end, please remember, it's not brain to brain. It's user station to user station. Please keep this in mind. It's a subtle difference. At which layer would I do that? I would do it at the lowest layer, which really works end-to-end. And it's pretty sure that the transport layer is working end-to-end. And some people even would argue that the network layer works end-to-end. So I wanted to be on the safe side, and I did put it at the transport layer level. If you feel that the network layer is working end-to-end, put it at the network layer. So the message is encryption, end-to-end encryption, should be done as low at a layer as possible. Why? Because if we do so, we are protecting as many headers as possible. If you can do it one layer deeper, you are protecting the headers of the layer above. link encryption. At which layer we could do link encryption? Here at the physical layer, we have bits. So bits are entities you could, in principle, encrypt. So I would argue, let's do link encryption at the physical level. So what does this mean? Let's assume here we have a message which is generated. So first, it's encrypted somewhere here or there. It's passed to the lower layers, and then it arrives at the physical layer, and here it's link encrypted. It's put to the medium and transmitted, and it arrives at some exchange. Usually here, link encryption is undone. Maybe it's passed to the data link and network layer at the network layer for routing, and then it's decided by the exchange where it should go. It's here encrypted again. Transmitted, here decrypted again. Maybe the next routing decision is done. It's passed towards lower layers. Next link encryption procedure, and here decryption. So what do we have? This user station and that user station somehow have to share keys, knowledge about keys, usually public keys are shared. And they should share cryptographic systems. It's not a splendid good idea if this station wants to use RSA and this station insists on Diffie-Hellman. Then probably both stations won't get happy with each other. And maybe the users will be quite disappointed. If we want to have that arbitrary user stations can encrypt for arbitrary other user stations, somehow cryptographic systems have to be standardized. Otherwise, it's really a problem how to interoperate. With respect to link encryption, everything is much more easy. Assume this is a link, it's a cable, or maybe it's a radio channel which is point to point. I don't care. Then it's pretty clear that here and here we have to have the same system for link encryption, and we have to share a key. But what we do here in red may be completely different system, different keys from what we do in yellow. So for each link in link encryption, you could choose a different cryptographic system. And for each link, it's fully okay if you have one system, one specific system for this link. It's okay. I'm not saying that this is, for mass production, the best approach. So maybe you have some standards, you get the economies of scale, splendid, good ideas. But in principle, you could do it differently on each link. So same here. From here to there, if there's a fixed length, you can do. And again, what you do in brown from here to there. So, last remark about encryption. If you do end-to-end encryption, you do have to know whether there's link encryption. No need to know that. Usually, you shouldn't know that. Because if you're working at the transport layer, you shouldn't bother what's being done on the layers below. You are just taking some kind of service. Which means for engineering and upgrading systems, This is a splendid good idea because even if in the beginning I don't have link encryption, I could upgrade my network by adding link encryption. If I would convince German Telecom to get slightly paranoid, then maybe they even do more than one encryption in the lower layers. But usually they are not paranoid because they know we have so many security weaknesses in our system. Mainly it's the higher management, which is a security weakness. So, okay. So far, layering in networks and encryption.